Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So it is with great pleasure that we get to have Tarleton Gillespie speaking with us today. Tarleton comes from, I guess you're technically in the communications school, although he has appointments everywhere at Cornell University, which is great. He has recently written a book called Wired Shut, Copyright and the Shape of Digital Culture. Although he won't be talking about this book today, he'll be talking about some of his more recent research. For those who are more on the theoretical computer science bent plan in the room, we should know that this is a social science talk. What this means is that the talk is not linear, and you can't assume that if you don't understand one slide that you won't understand the future. So the result of which is I'd ask for you to hold off your questions. Tarleton has done a good job of thinking about places where questions might be appropriate. And I guess I will let you go.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate it. So just as sort of a word of thanks to the Microsoft people, Dana especially, but everyone in the room, I really appreciate the hospitality. It's been a pretty interesting chance to be here. And I appreciate I'm sure that's going to fall. I hope that the indication that I've seen so far, which is that everyone's got this incredibly intense work that they're doing, but they're also kind of liking that they live on this hallway, that can be part of the pleasure of this. And for those of you who came over from elsewhere, from MIT or elsewhere, thanks for coming. So I'm going to try to, I come from a communication degree, kind of a sociological perspective on how new media technologies are emerging, what kind of impact they have on the culture, on the public discourse, on politics. And as Dana mentioned, the book that I did was dealing with some of the copyright controversies, and again, trying to tackle some things that are clearly legal questions, clearly economic questions, but also say, as we make decisions about, file trading, decisions about encryption around, film content, music content, we're making decisions about the shape of the culture. We're making decisions about who's an author, who gets to own things, who gets to distribute things, what impact they can have. And we're often doing them in very specific places, like the courtroom, like the FCC, like the halls of Congress. And I think in some ways designers are doing this too, right? They're establishing technologies that imagine practice in a certain way. And so in my mind, we need to sort of put these things in conversation together. We need to think about where these technologies land, how they have implications in people's real practices. And we can bring that insight not only to lawmakers, who need to think about that, to designers who are building the tools, and back to users as well. So from the work that I was doing around copyright, the main question was, how are we structuring public discourse? How are we setting the rules for what can be talked about, for what appears, for what gets told, for what gets shared, and for what things get left off the public table? And so the more recent research has been thinking about the rise of online media platforms, YouTube, Flickr, Facebook, MySpace, these very large-scale sites that try to play host to user-generated content, sometimes exclusively, sometimes in combination with commercial media, and how they're becoming, especially because for the big ones, they are the place if you want to host online video, if you want to post your photos. So when they set the terms for what's allowed and what's not allowed, both in sort of their rules, their terms of use, their community guidelines, and also technical rules as well, those rules are picking and choosing what's allowed online, what's highlighted, what's rendered invisible. And those have cultural implications. Let me start with a sort of vignette. This is a moment that intrigued me. This is a press release, a part of a press release that YouTube sent out at the end of 2008. Ironically titled the YouTube for All of Us, because they're about to tell you why some things don't get to be on the YouTube platform. And they say, as you can see, sort of as a community, we're going to start sort of taking greater care of the health of the community. We want to be a little more protective about the experience of coming to YouTube. And that includes drawing a slightly stronger line against, not pornography, which is already not allowed, but sexually suggestive material, indecent material, profanity, right? The kind of like, soft questionable material that you might see on the website otherwise. And they talk about 3 ways in which they're going to do this. One is they're going to remove some videos, which again, as I said, they remove videos all the time, but some videos that they hadn't removed before, they were going to consider taking down because they were inappropriate. They were going to push a number of videos past a sort of like age barrier. You have to prove that you're 18 by checking off a box. It means you have to be registered with YouTube. Anyone not registered doesn't get to prove they're 18. Obviously, that's a soft barrier you can leap over, but nevertheless, it puts it behind this sort of wall. And the third one, which I found particularly intriguing, and I'll come back to at the end of the talk, is that they were going to algorithmically demote certain videos that fell into this category. So they'd still be there, but they would be invisible on the most popular, most favorited, most discussed, all these mechanisms that YouTube users use to find their way through this massive archive to the videos they'd like to see. And I found that really intriguing. I'll come back to that. But it's an indication that the same kinds of questions that broadcasters have to think about, publishers have to think about, film studios have to think about, record labels have to think about what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, whether those are legal obligations or their sense of what their users won't like, their sense of what could get them into sort of cultural hot water, political hot water, are pressing on these new media platforms, right? The same kinds of issues. At the same time, the interventions that are possible for them, the kinds of things they can do, are both quite common. Remove things, that's a classic mass media move. Age rate things and make it harder for kids to find them, that's a classic media move. But also some sort of technical interventions that weren't available to broadcasters and publishers. And my sense is this is the kind of intervention that we've long asked as a political question. What happens if the editor of the newspaper will not allow certain topics? What are the implications for how we get our news? What are the implications for what is spoken about and what is not spoken about? What's the implication for who gets to speak? We know how to ask those questions about traditional media. We may not ask them very well all the time, but we have a language for it, and we know why we need to ask those questions. But I would argue that we don't quite have the language yet, and we don't have as clear a sense of how and why we ask those questions about these new media environments that nevertheless are hugely popular and hugely important in hosting what ends up online. Okay, so my sense is that, from a sociological perspective, there is a long tradition of asking this question. Commercial information providers that obviously have their own economic imperatives, their own legal liabilities, but are making decisions about what we see and what we don't see, that they are shaping what ends up in the public conversation. And we need to ask questions about why they do it, how they do it, and what the consequences are. Online media platforms are also curating what's available and what's not available, and so we need to bring that same kind of question to these set of providers, just as we did for mass media providers. At the same time, we don't want to assume that it's the same question. We don't want to assume that the tactics, that the reasons, or that the implications are the same as when we asked it about Time Warner, about Disney, about New York Times, about CNN. And a couple of reasons why we might think about this being different. First of all, these sites are playing host to content generated by users. Maybe not exclusively, but that's a big part of what they're offering. And that's different than a network deciding which professionally produced TV pilot to put on their evening schedule. Right, so the idea that they are going to provide a space, a big open space, for what any average user who feels like doing it is going to post, changes the game for how we can think about their obligations. It is increasingly complicated by the fact that these sites are sometimes trying to do both. Right? So YouTube, for example, their business includes trying to host movie trailers, music videos, news reports, and so they're actually playing both games. They're also in the business of what I'm calling comprehensiveness. So it was ABC's job to decide from all the things that they could put on their evening schedule which particular shows they were going to highlight. It's the editor of the New York Times' job to say what's going to go on that front page of all the news stories we could tell, all the topics we can investigate, all the things we've heard about, all the things we're going to report, what gets highlighted and profiled. So they played a role as gatekeepers, and that was one of the ways that sociologists began to ask questions about their role. If you're a gatekeeper, what did you allow through, what did you not allow through? What's the shape of what we saw as compared to what was the shape of what was possible to see? These online providers are in a bit of a different position. So I like thinking about Google Books, for example. So Google Books, in their project of scanning all these books, they would like to have every single book. That'd be very good for their business. They could say they have every book. They could be the one site you ever have to go to for every book in the world, and they would be automatically better than any other site that had most books, or some books, or one category of books. Because if they had all the books, then you wouldn't need to go anywhere else. YouTube would like to be the site where all video goes, because where would you go online for video? YouTube. So even though they can't include everything, and whether that's technical, Google can't actually have a search engine that covers every single page, can't actually have a book library that scans every single book for practical and legal reasons, they would like to approach comprehensiveness. It's a very different business. Right? So they have an imperative to include as much as they can. That doesn't mean they don't exclude, but their approach is different. And then finally, something that we're seeing as these sites grow is that these sites, whether they're social network sites or video sharing, media sharing, they often start by catering to very particular niche communities, either because they intended to, like Facebook, this is for university students, or they accidentally do, right? There are people who show up first and they start trading that kind of material, and for a while they have to maintain this business that has to do with, surf punks. And they didn't plan to do that, but guess what? That's where their community is. As they grow, they often want to draw in different communities. They often want to expand past a single community. And they're faced with this challenge of, do we cater to these particular communities, or do we try to be all things to all people? And I think some of these big-scale sites are facing this challenge right now. How do you serve particular niche markets and be the one-stop shop for online video, or the one-stop shop for online photography? That's another place where that's going to shape decisions they make. Okay. Nevertheless, there are a series of reasons, whether they're financial, legal, ethical, why they can't, in fact, host everything. They have to maintain a community standard, right? Although that's something that they struggle to define, so they don't lose people who think inappropriate material or dangerous material is overrunning the material they're looking for. There are legal liabilities for material they can't host, like copyright infringing material, pornography of certain categories. They don't want to tarnish their own brand. If they're working with advertisers, they need that brand to stand for something, right? They might have lots of users who want pornography, but they might not be able to sell themselves to advertisers if they have lots of pornography, right? So they struggle with that challenge. And for some of them, maintaining a brand and a community that's going to work with commercial media. That's going to be a place where you can post the trailer for the new movie that's supposed to appeal to families. So the question that I find interesting is, how do these sites promise to be everything and not everything at the same time? And to me, this is the first part of the discussion. This is very much about how they present themselves. So for those users who think of YouTube as having no limits, or Google Search as being every website, or Google Books as being every book, how have they bought into this idea or ideal that these sites in fact include all things? And the sense that these sites don't intervene, they don't pick and choose. Right? And these sites have carefully cultivated a notion that they are simply an open space upon which you can post your content. They don't pick, they don't prefer, they don't shape, they don't govern, they just allow. And that their mechanisms by which you're going to find things, whether you're searching, whether you're tagging, whether you're listing, are algorithmic and therefore neutral as well. This is a carefully presented idea of what they are that masks in some ways the things they do. So the second step is, how do they in fact intervene? How do we begin to get a sense of their techniques of intervening, their justifications for why they intervene, and then what the implications are? So these sites are removing things, as the YouTube press release quite clearly announces. What are they removing? Why are they removing it? And with what consequences? And then the third part, and this is, we won't touch on this much, but we can talk about it in Q&A if you're interested. Does this link us into a longer tradition of questions of free speech? Right? So if we think that these sites are having consequences, if they are limiting public discourse in very particular ways, do we have a legal question here? Not just a, wow, is that a good thing or a bad thing, but does free speech law actually urge us to do something different than what's being done now? So that's sort of a third question we can ask. Okay. Dana suggested that I pause for questions. Any questions that I can take at this point? Or shall I go on? Yeah.
I guess it's a question about community and how would you define a community. So in some ways I feel like perhaps YouTube started as a community, but now it feels more like a repository where I don't, like, maybe I don't feel like a YouTuber anymore.
Good.
Do you feel like that kind of...
That's a great question. That's a great question, because in some ways for me it's both what is it, what does it feel like, and what is it called? And I think there's a game that's played, and I think that you grabbed a great term. I'm going to talk a bit about how these sites use the word platform, but community is a real popular term for how they characterize themselves. And I think it's a part of how these sites try to manage our expectations, try to cultivate that sense, right? So you're part of the YouTube community. That's a sense of belonging, a sense of ownership, a sense of involvement. Those things can change because they are renamed. They can also change because through practice they don't feel like a community. They feel anonymous. They feel like a repository. So in some ways there's a discussion about what they're trying to be, and that's as they speak to users, as they speak to lawmakers, as they speak to their advertisers. And also then, and I don't know how you would determine this exactly, but sort of how does it feel to users and how those two things interact. Yeah, one more.
So YouTube, there's really sort of two different classes of people who participate. And one is people who make videos and make videos that are responding to other videos and linking back things like.
Right.
Then there's the commenters who are voluminous, usually of very low quality, seem to be almost unpoliced.
Right.
Doesn't feel much like a community, whatever it is.
Yeah, and imagine a third category, right? So YouTube is even more interested now in the people who just go to watch, right? So now it's this sense of like, there's also an audience who they never post a video, they never comment on a video, but they're the kind of people we can.
They might rate a video.
They might rate a video, but there's certainly a group of people they want to quantify, because if they're looking for advertising, if they're looking to convince media partners that this is a great place to put your new TV show, then think about all those audiences, and those audiences are quite different. I would say that we'd want to think both about all three of those categories, but also remember that they're porous, right? So there's movement between those. Those might change the feeling of YouTube as well as the business potential of YouTube. So let me start with our first question, right? So how is it that these sites make a promise that they are merely providers, that they are neutral in their offering, and that it's up to us to sort of offer these things up? And this comes in some ways from having taught this in classrooms, where I introduced to students this argument about traditional media. New York Times makes decisions, those decisions have consequences. Disney makes decisions, that has consequences. And they say, yes, and they get that. And they say, what about Google? And they say, well, Google just shows us what we put on the web, so what's the problem? Right? And very little sense, a sense that we probably have, right, as designers, as theorists, as people interested in law, that of course choices are being made, and those choices have consequences. But a broader sense that the promise is, well, Disney, they pick what's going to be there. They make family-friendly film, and they have to defend that, and they have to figure out what that is, and they get in trouble if they put something out there that's too questionable. But somehow YouTube doesn't, right? Flickr doesn't, Facebook doesn't. So here's a place where the questions that are often asked are posed in legal language and economic language, right? So how do these businesses function? What services do they provide? What categories do they fall into? How do we regulate them? What rights do they have? And I would argue that we need to add an additional layer, which is these businesses are building not only a technical service, an economic business plan, but they're also building discourse. They're also building the way they should be understood in language. And there's a very important part of their job. I thought it was very interesting. Everyone remember the Segway? So, Dean Kamen was designing this mysterious device, and we were all hearing about it. And it was this, if it was going to be what it was going to be, it was going to be this amazing. It was going to, replace walking. And there was a lot of hype, and it was like, can he do it technically? Is this possible? Is the gyroscope going to work? And one of the things that got the most in the way, and one of the things he had to spend the most time in, was going to local legislatures and saying, you have rules that say car, bicycle, walker. And this Segway doesn't fit in your categories, and you need to change your laws, or else the Segway won't be allowed on the sidewalk, and it's too slow for the bicycle lane, and you sure can't do it where the cars are. Right? So his job wasn't, can I make this device work? And it wasn't just exclusively, can I price it right to convince people to buy it? Can I advertise? Can I get it out there? It was the understanding of vehicles has to change. And that understanding has to change people's minds. It also has to change in the law. And that was one of the hardest things for him to run into. He ran into lots of trouble for that. I think it's a huge reason why it didn't make it. I mean, I wouldn't want to presume that it's the only reason. But there are a lot of places where the kind of early adopters who might have taken this into the world and shown that it was super cool and set the stage for other people to think about getting this couldn't do it. Because they weren't allowed on their college campus, and they weren't allowed in their sort of local sidewalk area, because the regulations simply didn't have room, like linguistic room, not just room, for this vehicle. Yeah. No. We do, yeah. And so one of the things that they were trying to do was to argue that it could have the kind of like potential benefit for a special category of people, which is disabled. But that wasn't the way they were trying to pitch it. If it was just, he had already designed and sold motorized wheelchairs. He was trying to design the thing that any of us would use. And so we have these special legal categories for special audiences. So he was running up against a discursive and legal terrain that didn't have room for his device. So his job, and what I would argue YouTube's job and Flickr's job, is to position their service in language as much as a commodity and a technical achievement. And that work happens in public discussion. It happens when they go in front of Congress. It happens in their advertising. It happens in their press releases. It happens in the way they talk to their customers. And there's an effort to set the terms. And I think it's a very important process for them. There's a couple things they need to achieve, right? Obviously, they need to achieve a sustainable business model that's going to accumulate profits. They're also in a very particular position in terms of regulation. They want laws that will protect them in the ways they want to, privilege them in the way they want to, and they want to discourage laws that will get in the way, that will impose liability. Right? And there's a really interesting situation that commercial actors are in when they call for regulation. My favorite is thinking about the movie industry, where they go to Congress on one day and they say, we need trade protection because people, there's all these countries who are saying we can't deliver our films over there and we need to have this market. You've got to help us. And then they go home. And then next week they come in and they say, please don't rate our stuff. We don't need your help. We can do it ourselves. Right? Deregulation. So a very particular discursive effort to position what you have, to call for some kind of legal help and to fend off others. And arguably, they're setting the terms for how we understand them. What do we think YouTube is? What do we think Facebook is? And that question of is it a community? Is it a repository? Is it a publisher? Is it a space? Is it a platform? Those terms matter, right? They organize our thinking. As users, they organize our thinking if we're thinking about how laws should apply. If we decide that YouTube is a repository, then the rules we already have about libraries might be relevant. If we think of them as a distributor, then the laws we already have for internet service providers might be relevant. If we think of them as a publisher, then we have a different set of laws. And so that metaphoric work, right, we are this, is a deliberate and strategic effort to set the terms for how we approach these things. So in the paper that was just completed, which I'm happy to distribute if anyone wants it, I play with the term platform. I don't want to make too much of this term, but I want to spend just a few minutes thinking about it. Lots of these sites have begun, especially in the last couple of years, to call themselves platforms. YouTube started calling themselves a platform in their press releases, the press release after they announced that Google bought them. And lots of these comparable sites have referred to themselves as platforms: blogging platforms, wiki platforms, sharing platforms, peer-to-peer platforms. And this is an extension of the use of that term from a more computational one, a sort of hardware platform upon which you build tools, to a platform upon which you can share content. Right? And this can get a little confusing because Facebook opened up its API, and now it is also a platform in the more traditional sense. But they use the term even when they're talking about sharing content, sharing pictures, sharing comments, sharing videos. I would argue that this term, not unlike community, there's another one of these sort of very powerful, palpable terms that tries to kind of coalesce all these ideas, is an attempt to shape their position in this debate about what we can expect of them, what they're allowed to include, and what their obligations are. It's not just the word, it's a word that is indicative of the way this is being offered up. Platform has a number of connotations. So computational is obviously the most direct one they're referring to, just like PC is a platform, and the VCR was a platform. We had the platform wars. So a term that's taken from hardware and borrowed from this model of something that can be built upon, carried over to this sort of sharing environment. But I would argue that when YouTube talks about itself as a platform, it's drawing not only on that computational meaning, but a broader, longer-term sense of what this word means. So historically, this term first came from a sort of architectural meaning, simply literally something you can stand on. And we still use the term that way. You're on a subway platform or an oil rig platform, we wear platform shoes, right? Something that raises us up in order to do something physically. From that, the term increasingly took on a figurative notion. So I'm going to take this entry-level job because it's a platform towards the career I want. Right? It's not actually a thing you stand on, but it's doing the same thing figuratively. And we also have the political platform. So we say, the Democrats have a platform, the Republicans have a platform. Historically, that came from talking about the stage that a candidate stood on. They're literally referring to the material thing, the platform. And it got carried over figuratively to the issues you stand for, not just standing on, the planks of your platform. We still talk about it that way. So this word has lots of sort of available meanings that I would suggest do more than just what the computational does. The Oxford English Dictionary starts with the first definition: it's a raised level surface. And I love that idea, right? This is part of the promise that these sites make. It's going to offer you up to something, but it's flat. It's fair. It's egalitarian. Right? There's a whole sense of sort of connotations here that don't have to be said, but are built into the sense of this thing and what this site offers. Very different than being a broadcast channel. Very different than being a publisher, which is a very different offer, but a platform. Right? I almost think, like, I can't help saying it, but sort of like make this hand gesture. It's a platform, right? And it's offering something. This is a tricky game that they're playing because it's not just sort of one audience they have to speak to. They have to appeal to users, they have to appeal to advertisers, they have to appeal to media partners, and they have to speak to lawmakers. And what's interesting, so in the paper I go through the way YouTube, as an example, talks to these different constituencies. And what's fascinating is that they use the term in all the environments, but they mean something slightly different. And the term eases the contradictions between trying to appeal to all four of these categories. So when they talk to the user, right, the user that wants to post their video of them doing something ridiculous in front of their friends, this is a perfect term. Broadcast yourself, right? This is the platform from which to be heard. If you put your video on here, people will see it. Right? It's a platform that will give you voice in this huge array of sort of internet space. And in some ways, YouTube has positioned themselves as the champion of user-generated content, right? That's where you find your thing. We're not Hulu. We're not NBC. This is where everybody can post their content, despite what we know about their sort of business model and their aims. Now, it is no easy task to figure out how to be an advertising company while you're also being the champion of user-generated content. This is not an easy match. There are plenty of people who think that user-generated content is corrupted by advertising. Nevertheless, YouTube wants to build a business that's going to combine the two. When they talk to advertisers, they also use the term platform, but it means something different. It's a platform of opportunity. Here's your chance to put your brand in front of the right eyeballs, right? We're going to collect people and show them your ads. This sounds much more like the offer that's made by publishers, the broadcasters, by TV networks, where it says, our users are the commodity, right? We'll put their attention on your brand, right? We'll privilege that content. Now it's not flat or egalitarian, right? It's specific, it's specified. As they've cultivated media partners, it said, come to us, put your trailers here, put your pilot there, put your sneak episode there. Let us use YouTube as your a place to reach new audiences, young audiences, hip audiences. It's also a platform, but it's more of a distribution platform. Among this mess of content, we're going to make sure that they see your stuff, right? It's no longer flat. It's a distribution platform upon which your things will be privileged. People will find your movie, they'll find your trailer, they'll find your music video. And they have all sorts of mechanisms inside of how YouTube presents itself where they can privilege content. It's not just like a flat open space to be searched. There's a first thing profile, there's a special area on the front page. The materials that the music companies put in, they get to sort of rearrange their pages and design them carefully. You don't get to do that as an individual user. So there's all sorts of mechanisms by which they shape this platform for them. As I said, when they speak to lawmakers, they have to speak out of two mouths. That's not a sort of criticism. Most sort of commercial actors seeking legal protection and protection from liability do this in all sorts of ways. When YouTube and Google want to support net neutrality, when Google and YouTube want to respond to Senator Lieberman's charge that they were hosting terrorist training videos, what they say is, we allow for free speech. Without us, this wouldn't be possible. We protect all the kind of very vulnerable free speech that this world needs. And they point to certain kinds of things, right? The Netta video out of Iran, right? People filming stuff in Haiti and showing us the damage, right? Really important, classic free speech stuff. Political speech, individuals speaking against government, individuals speaking against power. And we're there to support them. We are the platform, and we need protection as such. We're doing a service. We are the keepers of free speech. When they go to Congress and say, should we be liable for copyright infringing material that users post, we're merely a platform. We're merely a service. We simply, right, sometimes we're a platform, sometimes we're a platform. Right, so we're merely a service that allows for users to post. So that term and that language allows them to negotiate this tension between looking like something that facilitates, which means you have responsibility or praise, and something that simply allows and is handled by users. Right, the users manage this. So I'd argue that the idea of platform, and again, not just the term, but the way that they're presenting themselves to users, to lawmakers, to their commercial partners, allows them to make a sort of broadly progressive sales pitch while also eliding some of the tensions between users and advertisers, between community and commodity, between intervening and seeming neutral. Right? And those sort of offerings have to be managed, and they're managed discursively. I'll pause there for questions. Is there another question?
Yes.
Yeah.
How do you actually manage this discussion with lawmakers? Like, don't you kind of say one thing and then come back the next week and say something else?
The lawmakers.
Yeah. That sounds great. I wish what you just described were true. I think that the political maneuvers are expected. That they come in an environment, they come to different organizations, they come in different moments, they come in different contexts. Political efforts where, if they're testifying in front of Congress, they're testifying around a certain issue, right? So it's the net neutrality discussion, and it's not the copyright discussion. There are all these environments in which they need to manage these things. So as you know, YouTube is being sued by Viacom for copyright infringement, facilitating copyright infringement, not rapidly taking down things people are posting. Viacom doesn't talk about them as platforms. They talk about them as distributors. Right? In that context, they want to say YouTube is like a broadcast channel. They're like a publisher. Therefore, we can hold them responsible for copyright infringement. When they're in a different environment, they can call themselves something different. There's also a kind of flexibility with language. It isn't just like they come in and they have a banner that says, we are a platform. It's a piece of this discussion. And there's a lot of contextual work. So I think if the claims were stark enough, you might see a kind of hypocrisy call. But it's more fluid than that. That's my sense of it. Yeah.
Two quick questions, I guess. One is, I guess on the right side, I don't see how platform means much more than tool, but maybe I'm just missing it. And then I also wonder, maybe this is related, that if there's another audience here, constituent, which would be investors.
Mm-hmm. Oh, good question.
In that sense, I feel like platform is more of a reference to the computational metaphor, which the platform gave a monopoly power to the companies that control the platform. So arguing that you're going to be the platform of video, I think sends the signal that we will have that monopoly position.
Yeah, that's
true.
That's a great point. I have not looked at how they talk to investors. That'd be a great thing to look at, because I think you're right. The platform also offers that sort of first mover, sort of victory over the market kind of thing, and that would be very appealing.
Does it matter that it's platform for these ones on the right, or is it just important that platform is a vague enough word that it can just be synonymous with tool?
Yeah, well, I guess the way I think about it, so again, I don't want to play too much on the word, right? Because I would say there are lots of places that you can see them speaking to advertisers and not use that term, but the offer they're making is the same, right? And this term is sort of a way for me to grab it. But I would say that one of the things about this kind of terminology is that it's vague enough, but not so vague that it's meaningless. So I think that it carries all these connotations. We all know what sort of platform means. We all have that feeling. If we had to draw a platform, it would all, we'd draw something like this thing. Where'd it go? Right, there's something about the structural image of the platform. There's something about the metaphorical meaning of the platform, where that sense of openness and flatness conveys a little bit of that sort of, it must be egalitarian, it must be free. Or at least it works to link those ideas. I think platform, when they're talking to their commercial partners, is a little more than simply tool, because it has this sense of opportunity, right? It has this sense of we're going to get things there for you. So it's not just a functional mechanism, but it's a promise. It's an economic promise, which is different than the promise they make to users, which is a sort of promise of voice, right? You will be heard if you're on this platform. The promise to the commercial people is you will benefit financially from what we can offer to you. And I think those are very different promises, because the promise is not to you as a user. It's not you'll be visible above all else. It's you'll be visible because we make everyone visible. Whereas the promise to media partners and advertisers is you'll be visible more than your competitors and more than the riffraff, more than all the noise. Do you have a question?
So how do you contrast this story with that of Napster, maybe? And that wasn't so successful.
Well, I mean, I would pick out one piece of the Napster story, which is when Napster started to get in legal trouble, one of the things they pointed to was they said, we're not a file sharing network, we're a community. Right? So that's where community was an offer there. And it wasn't just an empty promise. It wasn't like, well, community sounds better, right? We protect community. Community's good, and file trading is looking like it's bad. But they actually redesigned the service, right? So in the midst of the legal process, they made it possible for you to, if you look up the song and you say, I'm going to download this song, you could see what else that user had, and you could actually then communicate with them, right? You could start up a conversation, say, oh, you like Britney Spears? I like Britney Spears, right? And they built that in part because they were defending against the claim that they were merely a tool for widespread piracy. The legal standard said, as long as it's capable of other uses, then it can't be held responsible for facilitating piracy, facilitating infringement. And so they worked to both technically change what they did and discursively change what they did. It didn't work, right? But they did do those things, right? So you can see that kind of play, especially in a legal environment where in some ways this all comes down to discourse, right? What are the words you use and what are the precedents that you bring to it because you think it's kind of like a library, it's kind of like a town square, it's kind of like a publisher. So that's where I would see that. All right, so let me keep going because in some ways the first question is the promise, but the second question is the reality, right? So how do we begin to understand the choices they're making, the techniques they're adopting, and their implications? Because in some ways we have to crack this picture a little bit, that this is an open platform for all of this, that everything goes there, and that it enjoys this kind of free-for-all egalitarian internet space where we can all post wherever we want to. How are they curating? How are they culling what's on there? And how do they justify the choices they make? Now, it's worth pointing out that most users, especially in this world of comprehensiveness, right, where YouTube wants to be everything and Google wants to be everything, Flickr wants to be everything, most users don't experience having something taken down. For most people, they post their Flickr picture, they add their photo to Facebook, they change their MySpace profile, nothing happens, there's no sense of intervention. I think that makes it particularly hard, right? Reporters know how hard it is for the story they're digging up to end up on the front page. People interested in being in the news know how hard it is to get there. Producers of television entertainment know how hard it is to get that show onto a nightly TV schedule. But for the most part, we post, it goes up, it's automatic, we search, we find, and we're all set. So it's only those moments where we face limitations or limitations that are imposed get raised as challenges where we begin to see the contours of these choices. So what I'd like to do is a tale of content management in 3 acts with an epilogue. So looking at each of the sites that I've considered and using them as emblematic about the approach they take and the implications of that approach. And in some ways, these are approaches that we can see in various formations and combinations over lots of sites. So I'm pulling them out to sort of highlight the differences. Okay, so we'll start with Facebook, and I would call their approach For the Sake of the Children. So Facebook has expanded quite dramatically in the last couple of years, not just in overall popularity and sort of cultural importance, but specifically who their audience is. So Facebook began as a service that was exclusive for university students. Started in the Ivies, expanded. You had to have an account through one of the schools to partake of this. Because it was built, if you remember, on the Facebook that you got when you were a freshman, and it was the sort of same idea blown out. Right? So every college got this. Then they expanded this to alums of colleges. They started including very particular technological businesses that sort of thought Facebook would be pretty cool. Then they went to high schools, and then they went to anyone 13 and over with a valid email address. So that's a dramatic move. And going from college students and the culture that college students accept and make on this space to anyone 13 and over is a big deal. They've also expanded with content, right? They've added, you can add photos, and the third-party applications that get designed and circulated. So in Facebook's principles, they have a language of free speech. And all of these sites, when you talk to them, when you look at their sort of self-characterization, the protection of free speech and the honoring of the free flow of information is common. It's a common rhetorical move. Right? So in their description of what they do, they say, we want to allow anyone to share whatever they want, and we want to encourage and protect the free flow of information. In the terms of service, there's a much more commonplace boilerplate about the kinds of things you can't share through Facebook. Porn, hate speech, violence, and there's a couple other categories that show up lower on the list. They've run into a number of controversies. There was a controversy around groups discussing whether the Holocaust existed. A number of people raising a question of whether that was hate speech, and they actually intervened in some but not all of the groups, took some of the groups down. There was a controversy when they started taking down images of women breastfeeding because they thought it violated their sort of nudity restriction. And most recently, the Secret Service got interested because someone was passing around a Obama assassination poll. Should we assassinate Obama? Yes, no, or if he passes universal health care, and people were checking it off and doing everything. And that was considered a threat to the president, and that was taken down as well. Although there's still a group, so if you want to join. In their description of how, when, and why they intervene, I won't leave it on that sort of hideous, I can go back to that if you want. They are proactive in looking for these things. So they go ahead and search images. They have a team of 80 people who are dedicated to this task and this task only. It's part of their customer service wing, but it's a portion of that group whose job it is to go through photos that are uploaded, go through groups, and find things that they think violate their community guidelines. And then make decisions based on, degree and characteristic, whether they want to alert the person to take it down, whether they want to, suspend the account and what have you. But it's a proactive approach, and the reason why they say they take a proactive approach is that because they address high school kids, because they address teens, there's a greater concern for obscenity, nudity, the classic categories that in the US at least we try to sort of shield teens from. So that sense of their audience leads them to take a relatively traditional proactive move. It says we will guard against a certain category before we are warned against it, whether by the courts or by users or what have you, and take it down in order to protect the community and sort of maintain an ethos of what's appropriate on Facebook. So the lesson here is that classic restrictions that we see in traditional media are alive and well, with the added feature, these are Clay Shirky's words, that we're in a publish then filter mode, right? So things do go up, but then they get taken down, right? Rather than being moderated, which can be done in certain settings, but not in Facebook. Story 2, Flickr, the porn's in the back. So Flickr has a slightly different model for handling this. Flickr, in case you're curious, has hardcore pornography on it. I'm not just talking about artistic nudity, I'm talking about hardcore pornography. You have to know how to find it. It's not that hard. But what they do is they have a policy they used to call NIPSA, not in the public search area. They don't call it that anymore, but it's roughly the same. They ask their users to self-rate the photos they post into one of 3 categories: safe, moderate, or restricted. And they have this nice sort of like cozy explanation. It's like if you would show it to your Uncle Joe, then it's safe. If you might not do it, then it's moderate. And if you certainly wouldn't show it, then you put it in restricted. You self-rate. Anything that's moderate or restricted can't be found if you're in search mode that is the safe mode. So you as a user can change your search mode, just very much like Google's safe search model. So you can look for all photos, that would include restricted, or you can look for a subset in safe. The site defaults to safe. You may not know that, but you've always been in safe mode until you turn that off. Flickr goes in and re-rates images that they think have been incorrectly rated. They will suspend accounts for people who are not rating or inappropriately rating. And if you form groups of photos, which is one of the things that Flickr does, if any photo is moderate or restricted, the entire group is restricted. Right? The entire group can't be found on a public search. So again, the search is filtered. You can turn the safe search on or off. And they encourage users, here's your 10th floor, to flag photos, right? So if you think the photo is inappropriate, I think this one's fine, then you can alert Flickr that this photo is inappropriate, that it should be restricted, and they put it in a queue and will consider whether it should be rated differently. So the lesson here, another classic technique: ratings, age distinctions, segregating content by where it belongs, with an added twist. Germany complained to Flickr that their rules about whether minors can find obscene material required a slightly more strict protection than Flickr was imposing. Korea complained, Singapore complained. Instead of imposing an age verification like YouTube, this is where you got to prove that you're a certain age to show it, what they did was they just made it so if you're in Germany, you can't turn off safe search. If you're in Singapore, you can't turn off safe search. Right? So now if you are a law-abiding adult in Germany and you want to see your questionable material, you can't do it. Right? So they took a tool that was designed to allow individual users to regulate what they saw, and they imposed it on an entire nation. So a second lesson: a tool designed for one purpose can easily be moved to another. And that raises questions. Right? What are the implications of taking this tool that's supposed to allow people to filter what they see for themselves and filter on a national scale? Okay. Third story, YouTube. The figure 8 of community governance. So YouTube claims that it does not and will not pre-moderate material. It does not go looking for inappropriate material. It doesn't search on its own. It waits until members of its community flag content that says it's inappropriate, and then they will consider it and make a decision based on that. I would argue this is I'll say this. They say they can't do it because there's simply too much material. Right? There's too much video being posted. They couldn't possibly moderate material or look for it proactively. So they only look reactively. This is a bit disingenuous because they look for spam. And obviously Facebook does it and Flickr does it, so it can be done. There's lots of stuff going up on YouTube. But for whatever reason, they say they're going to take a reactive stance. Users flag content that violates the community guidelines. Very similar to Flickr, there's a point under the video that says flag is inappropriate. If you click that, there's a whole bunch of subcategories. Is this porn, child porn, gratuitous violence, drug use, hate speech? Is it spam? Is it a commercial message? Is it revealing another user's private information? It's a whole subset of categories. Anything that's flagged goes into a queue. They have a team of people like Facebook, although they refuse to tell you how many, which is, I find interesting, where they are looking at material that's been flagged. And there's complex algorithms for when things pop up. So it's not just sort of, this got flagged first. If it's flagged for child porn, it goes right to the top of the list because it's the most imperative and legally dangerous thing for them to have. They have algorithms that consider how often a video has been flagged, whether it's been flagged by a user before, how popular it is, and that determines how quickly they respond to things. Their community guidelines are another kind of folksy, don't be bad kind of set of statements that specify a whole set of categories of things that you kind of shouldn't do or kind of should do. I would argue that we want to think about this approach as a figure 8. So YouTube has a very careful distancing of their responsibility and their role here. I would argue that in pushing off the responsibility to flag content, they're asking users to tell us which videos are inappropriate. Right? It's not us, it's users. Users patrol the site, but according to guidelines that YouTube drafted. Users can question the guidelines, and YouTube can decide whether to change them or not. Users can game the system, but YouTube can decide whether or not they're gaming the system, whether or not to listen to or ignore flags. Users can complain about things that are removed, but YouTube can point to the community as the very justification for why they're removed. It's the community that makes these judgments according to the community guidelines, and we're simply responding to those best intentions. It's a very interesting maneuver, very different than Facebook's more proactive approach, where they say, we're going to intervene first. And very different than Flickr's model that says, we don't mind people who kind of want porn, and we allow that, and we don't mind the people who want it to not have porn, and we try to make those things coexist. And we're seeing this increasingly, and especially that justification that says, there's too much for us to look at, so we need the community to do it. This strategy matches very well onto this question of liability. The courts and lawmakers, when they talk about internet service providers, when they talk about search engines, even when they talked about the telephone company in past legislation, they said as long as you are a mere conduit of information, of data, then we won't hold you responsible for what's in there until someone has alerted you to it, right? So this is why we could plot to do some crime over the telephone, and AT&T isn't responsible for that. It's also why an internet service provider isn't responsible for copyright infringement until someone tells them that it's on their site, at which point they have liability. YouTube is positioning itself to enjoy that liability, the liability that is offered to conduits, which is another structural metaphor like platform. Right? We are mere conduits. We allow things to pass. We don't pick, we don't choose, we don't produce ourselves, we simply allow. Right? And that structural metaphor is built into the law that says if that's what you do, publishers make content, networks are conduits. And as long as you're playing the conduit role, you don't have liability for the things that pass through. This has practical and legal value to distance them responsibility. They can fit into this safe harbor category that ISPs get, as long as they can prove that they're a conduit and they have no knowledge. So the lesson here is that content management can be justified by and obscured beneath this commitment to community. It's not us, it's the community. It's not our decision, it's the user's decision. And this allows them both to sort of negotiate what they're willing to remove and not remove, right? We think those complaints are merely someone gaming the system. We think those complaints aren't protecting free speech, so we'll ignore them. Or, look, we have complaints, therefore we'll take this down. Right? It gives them a very powerful rhetorical position. Let me finish with one last thought. So coming back to the press release that YouTube offered. We've seen in a number of these platforms removal. We've seen in these platforms sort of age verification and barriers. And then we have this third one, algorithmic demotion. And I think this is an intriguing story that adds a twist here that we haven't dealt with in traditional media. When I first read this, I thought, wow, what an odd and interesting way to make inappropriate videos less available without taking them down. So they're there, and if you know the URL, you go to them. If you search for the right terms, you get them. But if you decide to go to what's popular, you're never going to find them. So it's like, have we just made it harder? What kind of harder is that? What's the logic of that? It felt very odd to me. When I spoke to the director of content policy at YouTube, they said, this is why we're going to algorithmically demote content that we think is inappropriate. The front page that you hit when you go to YouTube for the first time, or even as a registered user, is automatically populated with videos that they think you'll want to watch. Those videos are drawn from the most popular, most favorited, most viewed. So if those lists are full of what they call bikini videos, then YouTube is going to look like a bikini video site. And they want to manage that first impression. They want that site to look like a site that offers fun videos, engaging things, sports, movies, whatever. And they'll obviously, as you're a regular user, they'll then use your own viewing and your own recommendation to customize that. But they still use those listings as a way to present. Flickr does this too. There's a reason why we don't know that there's hardcore pornography, right? It doesn't come through the search. It never shows up on the front page. That front page is instructive. You go to the front page of Flickr, and it's like, landscapes. If I aspire to be a professional photographer, that's where I go. Beautiful, sun dappled through, flowers, children, puppies, right? All the classic tropes of professional photography. Not drunk at a party, not the shot of the football field from way up in the crowd, not hardcore pornography. Yet those can all coexist. So that front page, automatically and purposefully, is instructive. And it's another way, another sort of norm established to set the terms. So I want to end with thinking about Amazon. Not exactly a media sharing platform, but facing a number of the same challenges. Ran into two controversies in the last 6 months or so. The first was that at a certain point, a whole bunch of gay and lesbian fiction suddenly dropped off the bestseller list, disappeared in a day. And it wasn't that these things were suddenly not being bought. People started to complain about it. There was some theory about a hacker. And then Amazon looked into it, and they announced, they had to sort of, mea culpa, say it looks like what happened was someone ended up sort of checking the box that called those adult, and those don't go on the bestseller list, and they disappeared. They rectified the situation, put them all back. I think that's a very sort of interesting insight, not only because of how it played out, but what it tells me about what that bestseller list meant up to that point. I, maybe as a naive user, thought that bestseller list was, what's the most popular book? What's the second most popular book? What's the third most popular book? But it's not. It's the first, second, and third within a set of categories. Adult is out, right? So it's measuring algorithmically, seemingly neutrally, a constructed category, which is appropriate texts. We still sell those other books, but we don't tell you about them, right? It's very much that, like, the porn's in the back room, we don't list that in our sales, right? We list legitimate books. Second controversy. Amazon got worried that their versions of 1984 and Animal Farm, George Orwell, fantastic irony, that they didn't have the copyright for it. So the thing they did was they removed it off of people's Kindles. You'd bought the book, it was on your Kindle, you'd read it, you'd put notes on it. The next day you woke up, it was simply gone. Okay? This felt like the safest move for them because it meant that they had not distributed anything that they didn't have the copyright to. Right? It freaked people out because their sense of ownership said, this thing was already, not only did I buy it, but it was in my hands. It was in this device. It wasn't on YouTube where suddenly like things get removed. It's their archive. It's my book. Right? So the ability for them to remove things that were already distributed, right? The maintained connection between the Kindle and the Amazon service, which would be true for the iPhone, which would be true for the Google phones, would be true for any sort of app service, any kind of sustained service model. No matter how close that object gets to your sense of possession, it's still available for them to moderate. It's still available for them to curate. Now, this drew a lot of attention and didn't look good for them, and Amazon had to apologize, and it got sort of ugly, and they said they would never do that again. They sent those people hard copy books of George Orwell. It's great. It was 1984. It was Big Brother. It was perfect. Right? Nevertheless, as a potential, this kind of technical and algorithmic curation that happens in a relatively invisible way, not just this video has been removed, you got an email that says this violates our community guidelines, you go to YouTube and you try to find a video and it says this was taken down because Warner Brothers complained about copyright infringement, but the vanishing of things and the modulation of what's available through these automatic mechanisms, what's made visible, what's categorically available, what's presented as available, whether or not it's there or not. So I'll stop there, but I would love to continue the conversation with questions. Thank you so much for your attention. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to ask, can you think of examples where political speech is either demoted or massaged in different ways? And I think maybe in the U.S. it's very protected, but maybe abroad, I feel like I've seen and heard of some. I'm curious what.
Yeah. So I'm certainly looking at the U.S. as a context and U.S.-based platforms, and there's lots of questions. Certainly an example we're thinking about now is China, where the stuff that's being removed is not being removed because it's copyright infringement. It's not being removed because it's pornography. It's being removed because it's critical speech, right? Speech critical of the government. I don't know if I have exact examples of that. I think they're numerous, so I'm not sure I have one at my fingertips. But it certainly raises that question about any of these techniques. It's one thing for a site in the U.S. to say, of course we take down child pornography. There's no question there, right? But we're going to protect free speech because we have this invested interest. And that flip side being saying, well, of course we're going to take down critical political statements, right? But we'll protect something else. So the categories themselves are situated. The techniques are available whether your politics are one or the other. There was a very interesting example. So again, Senator Joe Lieberman complained to YouTube, it was about a year and a half ago, about Al-Qaeda videos and other sort of Afghani videos that he claimed were sort of terrorist training videos, and that YouTube shouldn't be hosting these because they're a sort of national security threat. It was a very interesting response because they made a sort of impassioned statement on their policy blog and went out that said, look, you may not love, classic free speech defense. You may not love what's there, but this is speech and people have the right to post it. And they took half of them down, right? So their justification was that some of them were sort of close enough to incitement to violence, and that's a sort of category of free speech that you're allowed to impose upon, and some of them were just a political expression of a perspective that Joe Lieberman doesn't happen to share, and therefore they have the right to stay. So, definitely one of these questions is like, where are those edges where something that you truly want protected sort of disappears? I'm also intrigued by these ones that are like, not so obvious, like the breastfeeding images I think are really fascinating, right? Here's a category and it says, we want to exclude nudity. And when they exclude that, what they mean is like a person jumping up and down nude, right? The sort of like softcore pornography, and we have 13-year-olds and we don't want to have that on there, and we want to be nice, family-friendly. But breastfeeding is a really tricky example. It's a culturally fraught example. Where people who think it's close enough to inappropriate because you catch a half a nipple say, yeah, that's nudity. And other people say, if you start removing those pictures, you delegitimize breastfeeding, right? You make it harder for people to breastfeed in public. You undercut breastfeeding as an activity. And there are people who are very invested in saying this has been a less than respected activity in a public environment when it's incredibly healthy, incredibly important, should be incredibly, viable as a public element. YouTube making a decision, Facebook making a decision, takes it out of that archive. Does that undercut this sort of call to legitimacy? And that's a place where like a sort of gray area issue comes up because of this attempt for them to kind of curate their content.
So in most of these cases, it seems the providers are providing no legal guarantees that the material will be distributed. Have there been any lawsuits at all so far?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not thinking of any. I wonder if the thing that Flickr took down, the Obama sort of Joker remix image. I thought that they had a
The thing is that with lawsuits, one, everybody will go out of their way not to make them public and to settle them quietly as fast as possible.
Yeah.
So, even if you work for these companies, you wouldn't necessarily hear the lawsuit had gone on.
Yeah.
Unless somebody wants to make a fuss.
Right, unless someone who's bringing the lawsuit wants to make a fuss.
Right, but usually these things get settled so fast.
Yeah.
I just don't know. I'm not sure there have been, but...
What I find interesting that we are seeing is, there may be examples, and I'm not thinking of any, rather than using the courts as a way to respond, because you're right, because it's, there's already, this is the part I sort of walked over, First Amendment, if you read it literally, says the government can't impose a rule that would limit speech, and it doesn't speak to commercial providers. There's been lots of discussion over the 20th century, really, about, okay, to the extent that major newspaper providers, major television providers have an incredibly important role and their choices matter a lot for what's out there. If you believe the literal one, it's saying, well, A, they're not government actors, so the law doesn't apply to them. B, it says free speech, like there are opportunities. We don't have to make the providers ensure opportunities. They're commercial providers. There's another perspective that says the First Amendment is there because we're supposed to seek a healthy, robust, diverse public discourse. And if the Disneys of the world and the New York Times of the world are narrowing that, then we have some way to call them on it. But that's a dispute in free speech law. So it would be, I'm not saying easy, but you could see the defense in a court that would say, look, we're private actors. We're YouTube. We don't guarantee that every piece of speech goes on there. We have a business interest and we have liability. What you are seeing is users using the platform itself to critique the response, right? So a lot of sort of like criticism on Flickr about takedowns of Flickr, right? These explosions of photos that are in fact sort of critical political speech. When Flickr started taking down copyright infringing material, but the way they did it was they removed the whole page. And that meant that comments and discussion was all gone. And that's not copyright infringing material. So Flickr users mounted a sort of campaign that began to protest that move through images and linking it and responding to it. Facebook's done this a number of times where people have criticized the privacy changes and what have you. So a very interesting opportunity that the platform also provides, right? The fact that the site can't take down user criticism of the site, or it would get in an awful lot of trouble. It has no community guidelines against that. So does that afford a different kind of opportunity to challenge these moves? Yeah, okay.
Would you compare some of these questions and solutions to something like Usenet? So for example, with Napster, people put in music, other people took it down, they claimed they were the channel. You have something like Usenet in the 80s, or maybe the late 70s, where probably if you looked at the content or the size of the files, more than half of it might have been form of binary files. And there was some moderation in individual groups, but as a whole there was this almost beautiful anarchy to it. And it was really hard to remove stuff once it was there because it was in so many different servers in so many different places. And in some ways, it seems like you're advocating for something like that, and yet we had it and it's no longer here.
Yeah. So I don't know if I'm advocating for that. I'm not advocating for total rulelessness, right? Total boundlessness. I think what I'm saying is we need to think of that history, right? So we have a history where a lot of the internet applications, because they were under the public radar in the beginning, because they were inside of a very particular community whose standards were accepting of what happened, because things were managed in different ways, right? People got booted off of groups and they formed other groups and there wasn't real harm. A move from that period to a period where we see the rise of these very public platforms that have a commercial interest in their own maintenance, have commercial interests in advertising and media partnerships, therefore have public liability in ways that they didn't before. Did I just get super loud all of a sudden? That was awesome. This point is extremely important. Right, so we may have, the expectations have changed about how these things work, and the role that, YouTube would want to play as opposed to the moderator of a Usenet discussion, the kinds of solutions they're willing to impose are quite different. And in some ways, part of why that we're not good at thinking about this is because the game is different, but also because we have these kind of early set notions about the freewheeling anarchy of the internet. And I think right now we're seeing is standards being set by private actors about where those norms should be. And I think it's really interesting. It's not like YouTube's the only place you can post video. But YouTube is an immense place to post video, and they're also a standard bearer. So if you start up a video site, you're going to look to YouTube to see what they're doing. You may do it differently, but they're a model. And if you have terms of service, community guidelines, they seem like they're working, those are going to get borrowed. So the decisions they make and norms that are established there have a kind of profile, and they get sort of built into the understanding. And I think it's a very particular moment where those decisions are being built into the understanding in an environment where we kind of thought I thought there were no rules. Well, there are, and those rules are getting established, and they're established in explicit terms, but also in the way it's handled, the sort of arrangements. So to me, it's all right, I'm not saying get rid of them all. I'm saying we have to be very savvy about watching the techniques so that we know which ones of them don't play the game we'd like them to play, right? Don't have... Well, okay, so I'm going to be wary about platform because I'm talking about the way that that term's being deployed. I'm not calling for it to be defined a certain way, right? Because I think the language is such an interesting game, right? There are plenty of people who would say it's absurd for YouTube to call itself a platform. That's not what it means. There's other people who would say no problem calling it a platform. It doesn't matter, right? You could look at Wikipedia. You could look at MySpace and say they're playing a very similar game. They may not call themselves platforms, but they're trying to establish their intermediariness, and they're trying to do it in ways that define what their role is and keep them away from certain responsibilities. And so platform for me is like indicative of that, but it's not always the definition. So any of these, the question about free speech that I find really interesting is what role does the intermediary play? And that's a word too, but I'm trying to just say like, there's makers and there's viewers, and then someone got it there. And we have this shifting notion of whether and how to hold them responsible. Do we do it because they are responsible, because Napster encouraged piracy, or do you do it because that's the easiest way to stop it, right? They are the pinch point. Do they have certain protections because they're an economic entity? Do they have certain responsibilities because de facto they are the public stage? We thought about those things with broadcasters. We thought about them with shopping malls, right? Is a shopping mall a public speech space the way that the town square was, which was the most hallowed, important, protected space? Or is it like it's a private place, it's owned by an owner, they can stop any speech they want to? And the courts actually fell down the middle, right? They said you can't stop any speech, but you can reasonably stop speech that interrupts your commercial viability, which is interesting, right? So which of those metaphors is going to play here? And how do we ask, and maybe re-ask, maybe those weren't the right decisions, and we have a chance to ask them again, or they were, and we have to think about how these guys are now playing that role. So I'm drawing scrutiny to the practices. I'm not saying that all of them should be abolished. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about the Germany-Singapore cases, a little bit of the backstory of, because they're very different culturally, countries to have adopted the same mechanism of prohibiting the ability to switch off the safe search.
Yeah. So I should know more about it. So obviously the German situation is a little bit different than the Singaporean and Korean situations. All of them, as I understand, have to do with obscenity, right? So nudity, pornography, and I'm sure they define them differently a little bit. But it's about inappropriate sexual content for minors. And one of the interesting critiques is that Germany has also a rule about Nazi symbolism and paraphernalia. And Flickr doesn't block that. Yahoo blocks that, right, for sales, and you can't sell.
Sued by people in France.
Yeah, got in trouble for their limits about Germany. So in Germany, even though they have this one rule about certain kinds of representation, it was the question about minors accessing softcore pornography that was the concern. And again, I can't go into more detail of it because I don't know it, but the understanding was they need to take greater precautions for those things not to appear to a user. And so one precaution you could take is to say, okay, verify your age, and that's fine, and they can have a stricter barrier if you were coming from a German server or a Singaporean server, but instead they said, okay, great, we'll just turn off an unmoderated search for those countries.
Was there any community or user response to demand?
Yeah, there have been, and that's one of those great examples where you've seen protests on Flickr against this, but I haven't seen it have any impact, right? So there has been discussion. I don't know how broad the discussion has been. It has not changed the policy. Yep.
I think we were sort of talking about this, but the inherent lack of filtering is also imposes something that's sort of thinking about 4chan, which is complete anarchy.
4chan haunts this talk. I can't. Okay, no, it's good.
Well, but if you're talking about filtering, if you have the lack of filtering,
Yes.
I think the fear is that your site will turn into 4chan because there are reports of people on the internet.
Right.
That.
That's right.
You might want to explain 4chan to the people who don't.
Okay, yeah, so 4chan, and maybe you can explain 4chan later in more detail than I can. From what I hear, and you may be able to explain 4chan better than I can, so 4chan began as a discussion board that people were sharing images and has become kind of like a prankster site where they do very sort of, they as far as I understand, they started the whole Rick Astley, Rick Rolling phenomenon, the lolcats phenomenon.
The anonymous, non-organizational organization.
Right, the anti-Scientology thing. Right. So it's deliberately anonymous. You use handles and not names. It's deliberately not run by anyone that you know, although people know who the sort of head person is. And it's got this kind of ethos of anything goes. And they've initiated, YouTube has trouble with them, right? Because every so often they announce a porn day. And so everybody has planned to post videos that kind of like, most of it is some like Jonas Brothers video, and then there's a bunch of porn stuck in the middle. And they're all in the private category until the clock ticks and everyone makes them public, and they all go rate each other's highly, so everything, suddenly there's this explosion of porn, and YouTube has to go like find all this stuff and delete it all. So I mean, in some ways the 4chan model, there's two things I would say. One is, when you begin to think about these questions, there's sort of two elements that I think are interesting. One is the breastfeeding image example. Here's a community that feels legitimately like this should be a representation. They find themselves on the wrong end of a policy statement. And they're sort of a test edge for a category. Then there's 4chan, which is someone's always going to want to rip this down, right? Someone's always going to want to cause this mayhem. I shouldn't use always, that's too universalist, but an awful lot. So these sites have to manage both things, right? They have to manage the fact that someone's going to test those boundaries, and they have to manage that boundaries create edge categories that are not easy. Right, so 4chan wants to go in there and embarrass them, rip it down and cause mayhem. And the moms who are protesting about the breastfeeding images want representation. They feel legitimate in asking for it. So both categories. But the question you're raising is, does lack of moderation and sort of enforced anonymity produce a different kind of community? And I would say that raises the underlying point, which is no matter what policy you set, it has implications. I don't want to make a story that says policy A always produces community B, or policy A always produces community A, that it's not a one-to-one correspondence. Nevertheless, the policies matter because they begin to set the terms, they begin to create where those edges are, they encourage and discourage, they become targets or not. But other things make them targets. YouTube became a target because it got big, right? That's a big part of it. YouTube became a target because it tried to be all things to all people, because it introduced advertising and media content. That changed things as well. And that's a policy change, but it's also a business change. So yes, to a degree. Yeah.
On that a little bit, one thing I certainly experience is that places that are communities that claim to have rules and then don't enforce them very, very well, that tends to really turn off the people who are in them. Mm-hmm. They say, we're here because there are certain rules, and if the people who are in charge of it don't actually follow through on, that they're going to censor in certain ways.
Right.
I think, we were talking about why Usenet declined. Well, one reason it may have declined was because it was so uncontrolled that approximately got overrun by spammers.
Mm-hmm. Right, and probably the opposite, right? There's probably sites where users know there have to be nominally articulated policies, and they're glad that they're not enforced, right? So the degree of enforcement is probably another part of this story. Yeah. Sorry. Did you have a question?
Well, yeah. So there was the Internet Manifesto in Germany. So, and they talk about this on NPR a lot. So essentially, journalists still want more freedom of speech. So, you're telling us what is the state of the art, but is there any thought about, okay, what's the proper way things should be done in a systematic way so that you can reconcile, too much freedom, child pornography versus no? Because it seems that right now companies decide what they want, and from what you're telling us, it seems like people are happy, nobody's like pushing, asking where exactly the boundary is.
Well, I mean, I would say at least in the U.S., I don't know of sort of one place where that discussion is happening, but those discussions do happen. It's a messy question of how decisions get made on the fly alongside discussions about how decisions should get made. Right? So, my suspicion is that content policy at YouTube or Flickr is driven an awful lot by circumstance, by the situation that arose at the moment where it had to be decided. And these things can't be, you can't be like, we've got a new kind of pornography showing up, let's take 6 months and deliberate what this policy should be. So what you get is quick decisions, bursts of response, redecision, bursts of response, people leave, people don't leave, and they get played out in that context. I would think that there are discussions around some of these things. There's lots of discussions about how to, the copyright infringement questions. There's lots of discussion about sort of child safety, and that, how that should play out on the sites that teens and preteens are now habitating on. Those are academic discussions. They're sort of regulators' discussions. And I think what you get is sort of statements that come out of very particular contexts. I think that's hard because you get like the journalistic take, which is, free speech needs to be protected, and the examples that they're calling forth, and someone else comes out of the cyber safety discussion and says we need these kinds of protections for these reasons. And it's hard to reconcile those as, that one of the things that's really fascinating is like, think about the range of communities, types of people, ages, practices that coexist in a YouTube or a Facebook. So, how do you set the rule that says we're protecting the 10-year-old pretending to be 13 on Facebook who wants to talk to their, middle school friends, and the fetishist who has the right to take photos and share it with their community, and deal with the fact that 4chan shows up every once in a while, and deal with like some of the political speeches coming out of countries that don't want us to allow it. That's an incredibly complicated array of demands and standards. And so, in some ways, it's easy for this story to turn into a look at what a dopey decision they made. I think of it as, of course these are lines in the sand, and they're incredibly complicated decisions to make. They are being made in private environments, and they are privately motivated decisions that I think have public ramifications. So that's my question, is how do you bring those private decisions into an environment where you can say, are there public obligations or public implications of these decisions? But I don't want to pretend that they're easy or that they're made with full awareness of all the ways that they can have implications. So those kinds of statements, whether they're coming out of academia or the press or regulators, are also attempts to discursively and politically change the motivation. The last free speech question is kind of like, okay, so let's say we think that these sites are kind of making a bad decision. They're being too conservative, not conservative enough. There's categories that need more protection, less protection. That's fine if we think it. Do we have the legal right to impose it, or do we have only the legal right to suggest it? That's another level of this question, right? For us to say we can tell YouTube to allow or disallow certain things is another question about how much right we have as a government or as a community to say so. So that's why a lot of this we see through community pushing, through discussion, through sort of manifestos, through political pressure, rather than shouldn't there be a law that says X should be allowed and Y should be not allowed. That's part of our sort of, at least the U.S. culture of saying we don't come in hardline and impose these things. We say, in certain conditions, to certain degrees, only so we don't impose. We must allow the most stuff we can, and we don't like stepping in because that looks like a free speech violation. Yeah.
Where do you think? Maybe this is a question for where this will go in the future.
Sure.
But the role of these platforms in educating users, particularly children, around the ethical usage or navigation of these platforms.
Yeah, that's cool. I like that. I mean, we can see them educating their users in certain ways, like Flickr educating your users. This is kind of for professional photography, and YouTube educating its users by what it presents for certain ideas about what could be there. But those are self-interest-driven educations. They're not like a media literacy effort, right? Like, it's a lot to expect YouTube to say, like, why don't you go through this YouTube demo that shows how we see, we covertly make decisions about what's available to you, and you should be critical readers of, the fact that we draw all these limits around what you post, even though it looks like we're offering you everything. I think what's interesting about users using the platform is you could make that YouTube video, right? You could post it on YouTube, and I don't think they would have a reason to take it down unless you threw a bunch of pornography in it to show the pornography. It can be done. I don't know that YouTube would do it, but I think as a vehicle for doing it, that's interesting. Right? Then you've just got the classic education problem of how do you get people to listen, which is a different issue.
Just quickly, another question is, to what extent do the user communities have any power at all? Like in your presentation, it seemed that maybe the figure eight, kind of visually, they went back and forth, but then your position, the corporation decision being emphasized. So is it illusory? Do these protests always fizzle out? Yeah. Certainly on the technical side, a lot of the features come up from you. They're sort of negotiated, like Twitter, a lot of this stuff. Mm-hmm. But do you think that speech is different and users have no role? Or kind of where does that shake out?
That's a great question. I think my own de facto position is to be talking mostly about the power the providers have, right? So that's not necessarily my indication of what's true. That's like the story I need to tell because there's a kind of belief in the other side, right? Users come in and do what they want, and providers are just happy to have it there. So I'm highlighting the other side of it. But the question is sort of whether to tell the whole story, whether that's a tipped playing field or not. my sense, and I'm just hesitating because I'm just never entirely sure that which things I'm looking for, right? My sense is that when it comes to content questions, users can raise issues, but it's not just a question of did you not like this feature. It gets wrapped up in a language about legal liability and about morality, and so it's a position in which the provider isn't simply interested to give users what they want or seem like they're giving users what they want. They also have these obligations that they point to. And they're always worried about the silent audience, right? So it's not the fetishists who really want those pictures to be up, it's the moms, these sort of moms that are floating around on these sites apparently, that aren't saying anything but are going to just disappear in mass migration if they think that their 14-year-old can look at this content. So I do think there's a special dynamic around speech and content that makes it trickier than just a sort of feedback loop question, right? Do they know they should have this feature? Do they hear from enough people that maybe they should have this feature? Can they afford to do it? Is it technically feasible? It's got this added tension. So my sense is that of course it's a tipped playing field, that the sites set the terms for the debate, and then users enact that debate, but users also surprise sites a lot. And there's always the threat of mass migration. So I think that these sites do live in fear that if they push something too far and they lose half their users and they get painted as the ornery, conservative, stick in the mud, then they're gone. So it's like there's an edge of the debate that's risky for them that users have a great power over. But I don't know that like users kicking up a stink around a very particular issue, how dramatically that changes things. My suspicion is that on the whole it doesn't, except in certain circumstances. But for instance, this is why I'm like doubting myself because of what I've looked. Like I bet Dana would have good examples because you've often looked from the side of like, what are these communities doing? And I've always looked as like, what are these sites doing, right? So our conversation comes in the middle, and I bet you have really good examples where something turned that might speak to that question differently and say, well, sometimes you can play this very hard. And probably the last thing to say is that exaggerating them as separate is a little bit risky. At this point, YouTube, the corporation, and YouTube, the community, feel to me like separate entities. But as these sites emerge, right, the founders and the users are the community, except the founders are running it too. But they're known to the community when it's on a small scale, and so it can't just be like these are bureaucratic decisions and you have to deal and you can like organize a protest and we might or might not listen to you. They're more entwined. So that may be a story about change as well as these sites get bigger, more institutionalized, more bureaucratic.
At this point, I actually have to stop the questions, but I want to thank you so much
Thanks again.
for coming.